Miss Harriet Lyle had been warned about the Duke of Ashvale. She had been warned by Lady Fenimore, their hostess, who had taken Harriet aside before dinner with the air of a woman imparting military intelligence and said, "He is very correct." Harriet was seated beside him now, and she could confirm the intelligence. The Duke of Ashvale was, indeed, very correct. He was correct the way a well-maintained clock is correct, precisely, reliably, and with no visible interest in what the hours contained. He had asked about her father's law practice. He had remarked upon the lamb. He had offered a measured observation about the roads between London and Hertfordshire that managed, in the space of 2 sentences, to be both technically accurate and spiritually vacant. Each sentence arrived fully formed, correctly proportioned, and entirely empty, like a beautifully wrapped parcel containing air. Harriet, who had spent 26 years reading human beings with the focused attention other women applied to needlework, made her private assessment. The Duke of Ashvale had a face. The face was handsome in the way that certain ancestral portraits are handsome: dark hair, very nearly black, and eyes the color of rain on clean slate, set in features that suggested his forebears had been selected across generations for their ability to look impressive on horseback. The face was also, in Harriet's professional estimation as a reader of people, wallpaper. Expensive wallpaper, the sort one finds in houses where nothing interesting has happened in 200 years. A face arranged rather than felt. She ate her fish. She considered her options. She decided with the grim pragmatism of a woman who had been assigned seating she had not requested, that the lamb would have to carry the evening, because the Duke certainly would not. After dinner, the party withdrew to the drawing room. Lady Fenimore said, "Has anyone read the new Mrs. Fairholme, The Captain's Return?" I wept for 3 chapters. And Harriet, whose interest in the lamb and the roads and the Duke of Ashvale had been at best municipal, felt something inside her chest rearrange itself. Mrs. Catherine Fairholme was the most popular novelist in England. Her books, 9 of them, published over 6 years by Mr. Jessup of Paternoster Row, were borrowed from circulating libraries at a rate that had required a 4th printing of each. Her hero, Captain Julian Harding, a naval officer possessed of a devastating jaw and a total inability to produce a feeling through his mouth, was, by common agreement among the reading women of England, the most sighed-over man in the country. Captain Julian Harding did not exist. Mrs. Catherine Fairholme did not exist. Mrs. Catherine Fairholme was the Duke of Ashvale. The man whose face Harriet had assessed as wallpaper was, between the hours of midnight and 4 in the morning, in a locked study, by candlelight, with a spaniel named Seneca asleep under the desk, writing sentences that made women put their books down and stare at the ceiling with the expression of people who had been, very specifically and for the first time in their lives, understood. His valet, Mr. Pruitt, knew, because Mr. Pruitt laundered the ink stains and because Mr. Pruitt had once walked into the study at 3 in the morning and found the Duke weeping over a manuscript page in which Captain Harding was telling a woman he loved her. Mr. Pruitt had backed silently out of the room and never mentioned it. Mr. Pruitt collected the manuscripts. Mr. Pruitt delivered them to Mr. Jessup in a plain wrapper, without the ducal seal. Mr. Pruitt was, in the private estimation of the publishing world, Mrs. Fairholme's extremely devoted and unusually tall assistant. Miles wrote at night. He locked the study door. He lit the candle. He wrote Captain Harding into gardens and harbors and rain-soaked lanes in the quiet, devastating moments where a man who cannot speak finds a way to speak. Captain Harding was Miles's mouth. The pen was where the feeling went. The mouth was where the feeling stopped. He had been doing this for 6 years. He was standing by the mantelpiece now, holding his port, when Harriet said, "The confession scene in Chapter 9 is the best thing she has written. When he says, 'I have been composing letters in every room I have entered for 3 years. None of them had an address. You are the address.'" 4 women sighed. Miles tightened his grip on the glass. She had quoted his sentence. the sentence he had written at 2 in the morning in October. Harriet said, "Captain Harding's silence is not a device. Most writers use silence as romantic tension. Mrs. Fairholme uses silence as portraiture. She is painting a man who cannot speak. The silence is the painting." Miles's knuckles, around the glass, went white. Lady Fenimore turned to him. "Your Grace, have you read Mrs. Fairholme?" "I have not," said Miles. Harriet looked at him. She read him the way she read novels, closely, carefully, and with the assumption that the text owed her something. She said, "You should. You are the most correct man I have sat beside at dinner in 3 seasons. You produced 400 words of nothing over 3 courses. Mrs. Fairholme could teach you something about the other kind of words, the kind that are not nothing." Something happened to the Duke's mouth. It was not a smile. It was the location where a smile would have stood if a smile had applied for permission, been reviewed by a committee, and been provisionally approved for further consideration. The location shifted. The permission was not granted. Mr. Pruitt, standing by the door, had heard the exchange. His face was performing what was arguably the most extraordinary act of professional composure in the history of domestic service. He was not smiling. He was categorically, definitively, with all the authority of 12 years' service, not smiling. He would later tell the housekeeper, Mrs. Lennox, that the Duke had met a woman who had told him to read his own books. He would add, after a considered pause, that it was the most dangerous moment of his career, and he included the time Seneca ate the draft of Chapter 6. Miles's grandmother, the Dowager Duchess, 82 and sharp as a new scalpel, heard about the Fenimore dinner with the calm interest of a woman who had been waiting for something specific to happen for approximately 8 years. Augusta Courtenay had found a manuscript page in the library 8 years ago, in Miles's handwriting, and she had read the page, and the page contained a sentence about a man standing in a garden, unable to speak. And Augusta had sat very still for a long time, and then she had placed the page back where she had found it, and she had never mentioned it. And she had begun, with the patience of a general conducting a campaign measured in years, to arrange things. She said to Miles over breakfast, "The Ashvale Library has not been properly catalogued in 40 years. I have made inquiries. Miss Lyle, I am told, has catalogued 3 private collections. She comes highly recommended." Miles said, "The Miss Lyle who told me my face was wallpaper." Augusta said, "I have been searching for the correct word for your face for 30 years. Wallpaper is the word. The woman is a national treasure. Hire her." We will take a very short break. If you do not want to miss new stories, please subscribe to the channel. Harriet arrived at the Ashvale estate on a Monday in late August with 2 trunks, a ledger, and the professional demeanor of a woman who catalogued libraries the way other people went to war, with systems, supplies, and the expectation of resistance. The Ashvale Library was 9,000 volumes spread across 2 stories of oak shelving in a room that smelled of leather and slow time. It had not been properly organized since the 3rd Duke, who had arranged everything by the height of the spine, which was a system that prioritized aesthetics over function, and which meant that a treatise on Hertfordshire drainage sat between a volume of Ovid and a book of Psalms that nobody had opened since the reign of George II. Harriet assessed it the way she assessed everything, quickly, accurately, and with the private conviction that she could fix it. The Duke avoided the library for the first 3 days. This was a professional decision on the Duke's part, since the library contained 9,000 books, and also, now, Harriet Lyle. And the library was also 14 feet from his study, where the desk contained the manuscripts, and Mr. Pruitt had entered a state of heightened vigilance that he would later describe to Mrs. Lennox as the most sustained period of operational tension since the incident with the sideboard. Pruitt cleared every surface. Pruitt locked the study. Pruitt intercepted an ink-stained cuff that had been left over a chair back 6 feet from where Harriet was alphabetizing the natural history section. Pruitt performed these operations with the quiet intensity of a man diffusing ordnance. On the 4th day, Miles needed a land survey from the library. He entered. Harriet was on the rolling ladder, 7 feet up, with a stack of folios balanced on one arm and a pencil behind her ear. She was wearing a gray dress with the sleeves pushed to her elbows. Her hands were dusty. She said, without looking down, "The land surveys are in the East Bay, third shelf, behind a 14-volume history of Shropshire that someone has placed there out of either ignorance or malice." He found the survey. He did not leave. This became the pattern. He entered the library for estate business. He stayed for Harriet. She did not make him stay. She simply occupied the room with such focused, competent energy that the room became more interesting with her in it, the way a landscape becomes more interesting when the weather changes. She found Mrs. Fairholme's novels on a low shelf near the window, misclassified under F, foreign travel. She moved all 9 to a prominent position in the fiction section, spines facing outward, at the exact eye level of a man 6 feet tall. She said, "I have moved Mrs. Fairholme to fiction, where she belongs. You still have not read her." He said, "I have been occupied." She said, "You have been occupied for 6 years. Mrs. Fairholme has produced 9 novels in that time. She is more productively occupied than you are." Something not quite a smile visited the neighborhood of Miles's mouth, surveyed the property, inspected the foundations with professional interest, and departed without making an offer. They began to talk. Not about novels, about the estate. The tenants at Marsh Farm had a leaking roof. The Michaelmas accounts wanted reconciling. The Southfield drainage had failed after the August rains, and 4 families were at risk of flooding if it was not fixed before the autumn storms. Harriet had opinions about drainage. Harriet had opinions about everything, delivered with the calm authority of a woman who considered competence a form of speech and who had been speaking fluently in it for 26 years. She came with him to Marsh Farm. She assessed the roof with the quick eye of a woman who had managed a household on a barrister's modest income and who knew the difference between a repair and a ruin. She talked to the tenant's wife about the damp and the children and the stores for winter. She was practical. She was kind. She did not perform the kindness. She simply did the thing that needed doing and moved to the next thing. And Miles, who had spent 30 years watching people perform kindness at him from across the vast distance of his title, watched a woman be kind without noticing she was doing it. And the watching changed something in his chest that he could not have named, and did not try to name because naming feelings was what the pen did, and the mouth did not. He mended a shutter at Marsh Farm, his hands on the wood, his coat off, his sleeves turned back. Harriet watched his hands. She had called his face wallpaper, but his hands were not wallpaper. His hands were weather, long-fingered, capable, sure. The hands of a man who used them. She filed this observation the way she filed everything, precisely, in the part of her mind that catalogued evidence that contradicted her initial assessment. They walked back across the fields. She said, "You are a better landlord than your face suggests." He said, "My face suggests nothing, I am told." She said, "Your face suggests expensive paint over good architecture. The architecture is becoming visible. I approve of the architecture." He looked at her. She was walking beside him across a muddy field in a gray dress with dust on her sleeves and her hair escaping its pins, and her hands chapped from the cold, and her face open and direct, and reading him the way she read everything, with the assumption that the text owed her something. And Miles, who had spent 6 years writing about the experience of looking at a woman and having the looking mean something, was looking at a woman, and the looking meant something, and the meaning was not going through the pen, and was not going through the mouth, and was simply sitting in his chest like a stone that was warm. In the library, the work continued. She catalogued. He found reasons to be there. They developed a ritual. She brought tea from the kitchen each morning, 2 cups, and they sat among the books and talked while the steam rose and the morning light moved across the spines. The tea was the daily negotiation of 2 people who were not admitting what they were negotiating. The dowager visited the library on the 3rd afternoon. She entered with the slow, imperial progress of a woman who considered all rooms her rooms, and all progress her pace, and she stood for a moment watching Harriet on the ladder and Miles at the map table pretending to review a survey he had already reviewed twice. Augusta said, "The library looks improved." Harriet said from the ladder, "The library is a crime against organization, Your Grace. The second Duke alphabetized by spine height. I have found Pliny, shelved between a farrier's manual and a recipe for gooseberry fool." Augusta said, "The second Duke was a man of limited interests and considerable confidence. He reminds me of most men." She looked at Miles. Miles was looking at the survey. Miles was not looking at the ladder, which meant Miles was thinking about the ladder, which meant Miles was thinking about the woman on the ladder, which meant Augusta's campaign was proceeding exactly on schedule. She said, "Miles, help Miss Lyle with the upper shelves. She cannot reach them, and I will not have the woman breaking her neck before the natural history section is complete." Miles helped with the upper shelves. This involved standing at the base of the ladder while Harriet handed down volumes, which involved their hands meeting around the spines of books at regular intervals, which involved Miles developing a detailed and unwelcome awareness of the specific way Harriet's fingers gripped a leather binding, which was the same way she gripped everything, firmly, practically, with the assumption that the thing in her hand was going to cooperate. She handed him a folio from the top shelf and lost her balance. Her hand caught his shoulder. His hand caught her waist. For 2 seconds she was half falling, and he was half catching, and the distance between their faces was the distance between the folio and the floor, which was approximately 8 inches. She smelled of dust and lavender, and the particular warm human scent of a woman who had been working. He smelled of ink and clean linen. She said, "I have the folio." He said, "I have, yes." She said, "You can release the folio." He released the folio. He had been releasing folios for 30 years, and not once had the releasing required this much attention. She climbed down the ladder without further incident. Neither mentioned the 8 inches. Both remembered them. The Michaelmas accounts arrived on the 4th week and were, in Harriet's professional estimation, a disaster. Not a dramatic disaster, the sort of quiet, compounding disaster that happens when an estate steward has been recording figures with the accuracy of a man who considers arithmetic optional. Harriet found the ledgers in the estate office and carried them to the library and spread them across the reading table and said, "Your steward has been adding columns the way other people guess the weather, approximately and with hope." Miles said, "The accounts are the steward's province." Harriet said, "The accounts are wrong. The Southfield drainage alone is undercosted by £40, and the timber receipts do not match the mill records, and your tenant at Hill Farm has been paying rent on the wrong acreage for 3 quarters. Miles looked at the ledgers. He looked at Harriet. He said, "You read the accounts." She said, "I read everything. The accounts are a text. This text has errors. I am correcting them." They worked on the accounts together, side by side at the library table, bent over the same ledgers, their elbows inches apart. She was faster with figures than he was. She pointed out discrepancies with the focused pleasure of a woman who considered accurate arithmetic a moral position. He wrote the corrections in his careful hand while she dictated. The work took 3 evenings. By the 3rd evening they had fallen into the rhythm of 2 people whose competences fit together. A rhythm that was not romance, but was the soil in which romance grew, which was shared purpose and mutual respect, and the quiet pleasure of being good at a thing alongside someone who was also good at a thing. On the last evening, working late, the candles low, she looked up from a column of figures and found him watching her. Not the walls watching, not the Duke's composed observation, a different watching. The watching of a man who was seeing something and who did not have the architecture to hide that the seeing was costing him something. She said, "You are staring." He said, "I am reviewing the figures." She said, "The figures are on the ledger. You are looking at me." He looked at the ledger. She returned to the column. The candle burned. The room was warm and quiet and close, and the closeness was a kind of sentence that neither of them was reading aloud. She read aloud sometimes, passages she admired from the collection. One afternoon she picked up the lantern on the stair, from the shelf and read a paragraph. Captain Harding, standing in the dark of a great house, holding a lantern, and the lantern lighting the face of a woman on the stairs. She said, This passage, the lantern trembling because the hand is trembling, because the man's composure is cracking, and the movement is the most intimate thing Captain Harding has done with his body, because the movement is involuntary. That is writing. She looked up at Miles. She said, You should read this passage. You would understand it. He said, The passage is effective. She put the book down with the precision of a woman who was about to commit an act of literary violence. She said, Effective. Effective is a word for a drainage report. That passage is the sound of a man's entire interior trying to come through his hands. You are a man who mends shutters with his own hands, and you said, Effective. He said, The craftsmanship is evident. She said, The craftsmanship. You are reviewing a scene about a man falling apart, and you have said, Craftsmanship. You are the most infuriating man in Hertfordshire. Miles held his teacup. He was sitting 6 feet from a woman who was reading his own prose to his face, and he could not tell her, and the not telling was the wall, and the wall was, at this distance, the cruelest thing he had built in 6 years of building. She noticed the ink, a small stain on the inside of his right thumb, dark as a bruise. She noticed it on a Thursday, when he reached for a book on the same shelf she was reaching for, and their hands arrived at the same spine at the same moment. Both stopped. Both noticed. Neither pulled away for a beat longer than the reaching required. She said, You have ink on your hand. He said, An occupational hazard of correspondence. She said, That is not correspondence ink. Correspondence ink is on the fingers. That is writing ink. That is the ink of someone who holds a pen for hours. She filed the ink alongside the composure that cracked when Captain Harding was mentioned, and the hands that mended shutters, and the face that was, she was increasingly certain, not wallpaper at all, but a wall. And behind the wall was a man whose hands were more honest than his mouth, and the dishonesty of the mouth was not cruelty but fear. And the fear was the same fear Captain Harding carried in every novel, and the similarity between the Duke and the fictional captain was becoming, in Harriet's professional estimation, too precise to be coincidence. She said, on a Friday afternoon, putting a book back on the shelf with her back to him, You remind me of her. He said, Of whom? She said, Mrs. Fairholme. Not the prose, the silence, the quality of the silence. You and Mrs. Fairholme have the same silence. The silence of a person who has a great deal to say and who has built a wall. She turned, she looked at him, she said, The frequency is the same. Miles held his teacup. She was 3 feet from the truth. She thought the similarity was coincidence. She did not know the similarity was identity. He could have told her. The telling was in his chest, pressing against the wall, and the wall held. And the wall had held for 6 years, and the wall would hold for another minute, another hour, another week. Because the wall was the Duke, and the Duke was all Miles had, and the having was the saddest sentence he had never written. Augusta, who happened to be passing the library door at the precise moment of this exchange, because Augusta happened to be passing doors at the precise moment of important exchanges, the way other people happened to breathe, paused. She heard the silence. She assessed it with the clinical precision of a general reviewing field positions. She continued down the corridor. She said to Mr. Pruitt, who was polishing a candelabrum with the focused intensity of a man who was absolutely not eavesdropping, The positions are holding. It will not be long now. Mr. Pruitt said, I could not say, Your Grace. Augusta said, You could. You choose not to. That is the correct decision. Lady Constance Waverley observed the Duke's new domestic arrangement with close attention and mounting alarm. Lady Constance was 30, a widow, and beautiful in the way that carefully maintained things are beautiful. Her late husband had left her a house she could not heat, debts she could not acknowledge, and a mother-in-law who would reclaim the house the moment Constance failed to remarry. She had been positioning herself near the Duke of Ashvale for 2 seasons. Now a barrister's daughter was living in his house, cataloging his books, drinking tea with him every morning, and walking across fields with him in the afternoon. Lady Constance counted the weeks and felt the cold, structural fear of a woman whose life depended on a man's attention and whose man's attention had turned toward the library. We will take a very short break. If you do not want to miss new stories, please subscribe to the channel. It happened on a Tuesday in the 5th week. Harriet was on the library ladder, the top shelf, east wall, where volumes had been pushed to the back and forgotten. She was reaching behind a row of Latin grammars that nobody had touched since the Second Duke when her fingers found pages that were not bound. Loose pages, manuscript pages. She pulled them out. The handwriting was dense and elegant. She recognized the prose before she recognized the hand. Captain Harding stood in the garden. The garden was dark. The garden had been dark for as long as the captain could remember, which was a way of saying that the dark was not the garden, but the captain, and the dark was not an absence of light, but an absence of a voice. And the voice was inside him, the way a root is inside the earth, alive and growing and entirely unable to break the surface. She held the page. She read it again. She knew this passage. She had read it in The Lantern on the Stair, published 2 years ago by Mr. Jessup of Paternoster Row. She held the published novel in her memory, and the manuscript page in her hand, and the handwriting on the page was the same handwriting she had seen on the Duke's correspondence. The same hand that held a pen for hours, the same hand with the ink stain on the thumb. She came down the ladder. She held the page. Her heart was doing something she could not catalog. Miles entered the library. He saw the page in her hand. He saw her face. There is a kind of silence that is not the absence of sound, but the presence of something that cannot survive sound. The library held that silence for 4 seconds. She said, "Your Grace, this is a manuscript page, in your handwriting. It is a passage from The Lantern on the Stair." Miles's face, which had spent 5 weeks in the slow process of becoming something other than wallpaper, which had cracked and shifted and allowed the architecture beneath to become visible, which had, in the presence of Harriet Lyle, begun to acquire the thing she called weather. The face reversed. The weather departed. The wallpaper returned. Not the expensive wallpaper of the Fenimore dinner, something harder, something that had been waiting behind the weather for exactly this moment. The composure of a man who has been found and who responds to the finding not with honesty, but with the oldest, deepest, coldest version of the wall. He said, "The cataloging is complete, Miss Lyle." She said, "The cataloging is not complete. I am asking you a question." He said, "Mr. Pruitt will arrange your compensation for the work to date. I am grateful for your thoroughness." She held the page. She was holding a passage from the most important novel in the English language in the handwriting of a man who had just looked at her with the composed, empty, arranged expression of a duke who was producing 400 words of nothing. And the nothing was worse now, infinitely worse, because she had seen the weather. She had seen his hands on a shutter, and his face across a cup of tea, and the ink on his thumb. She had been reading the wall for 5 weeks, and the wall had been opening, and now the wall had closed, and the closing was the loudest silence she had ever heard. She said, "You are Mrs. Fairholme." He said, "Thank you for the tea, Miss Lyle. That will be all." He left the library. He walked past her, and he did not look at her. And the not looking was Captain Harding in Chapter 7. The not looking was the harbor scene. The not looking was the exact thing Mrs. Fairholme had spent 9 novels describing. A man who cannot stay in the room with the person he is falling in love with, because the staying would require the wall to come down, and the wall is the only architecture he has. Harriet stood in the library holding the page. She did not cry. She put the page on the table. She picked it up. She folded it precisely and put it in her ledger. She collected her coat. She walked out of the Ashvale house, and she walked down the avenue of elms, and she did not look back, because looking back was a thing Captain Harding did, and Harriet Lyle was not Captain Harding. Harriet Lyle walked forward. Forward was the only direction available to a woman who had been dismissed from a library by a duke whose handwriting she was carrying in her ledger. She went home. She sat at her father's kitchen table. She unfolded the page and read it again. The garden scene, Captain Harding's voice. In the duke's hand. The man who mended shutters and ate toast and said effective and held her waist when she fell from the ladder, and whose face had been acquiring weather for 5 weeks, had written this. Had written all of it, all 9 novels, every sentence she had read aloud in the library, every passage she had pressed him to admire. She had been reading his novels to him. She had been reading him to himself. She read the page a 3rd time. She made tea. She did not drink the tea. The tea sat on the table next to the manuscript page, and both grew cold. Her father came home from chambers. He found her at the table with the cold tea and the page. He said, "Harriet." She said, "The Duke of Ashvale is Mrs. Fairholme. He writes the novels. He has been writing them for 6 years. I found a manuscript page. I asked him. He said thank you for the tea and sent me home." Her father, the barrister, sat down. He assessed the information with the same focused attention he applied to evidence. He said, "The man who mends shutters." She said, "The man who mends shutters." He said, "And he sent you away." She said, "He sent me away. The way Captain Harding leaves in every novel. The way the man who cannot speak walks out of the room rather than speaking." Her father was quiet. Then he said, "The question, as I see it, is whether the walking out is the verdict or the adjournment." Harriet looked at her father. Her father, who assessed people with the same precision she did, who had taught her to read evidence, who understood that silence is sometimes a wall and sometimes a door. Her father, who had met the Duke 4 times and had said the Duke was acceptable, and who meant it. She folded the page. She put it back in her ledger. She would wait. Not because waiting was easy, because the evidence was incomplete. At the Ashvale house, Mr. Pruitt found Miles in the study. Miles was sitting at his desk. The candle was not lit. The manuscript pages were in the drawer. The pen was in its stand. Mr. Pruitt said, "Your Grace sent Miss Lyle away." Miles said, "Miss Lyle found a manuscript page." Mr. Pruitt said, "I see, and your Grace responded to the situation with—" Miles said, "I said thank you for the tea." Mr. Pruitt was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Your Grace, in 12 years of service, I have managed many situations of professional difficulty. Seneca and the manuscript, the ink and the silk waistcoat, the time your Grace wept over chapter 14 and I pretended to have heard nothing. But I wish to observe that sending away the one woman who has caused your face to have weather, at the precise moment she discovered the reason for the weather, using the phrase, 'Thank you for the tea,' is the single most catastrophic deployment of good manners I have witnessed in my career, and I include the incident at the Marchioness of Pemberton's garden party." Miles said nothing. Pruitt was right. Pruitt was always right. The pen was right. The mouth was the problem, and the mouth had just produced, "Thank you for the tea," at the one moment in 30 years when the mouth needed to produce something else. That night Miles wrote, not the 10th novel, not Captain Harding. He wrote a chapter about a woman cataloging a library, her hands on the spines, dusty and capable. The gray dress with the sleeves pushed up, the tea, the morning light, the walking across fields. He wrote the way her accuracy felt in his chest, a pressure, a hand on the wall, testing. He wrote himself, not Captain Harding. Miles. The chapter was the first thing he had written in 6 years that did not borrow another man's mouth. He put the chapter in the desk drawer. It was not for Mr. Jessup. It was not for the circulating libraries. It was the thing he could not say, held in the only form that the thing would take, which was ink. On Wednesday morning, Mr. Pruitt collected what he believed were the new manuscript pages for delivery to Mr. Jessup. Mr. Pruitt collected the wrong ones. The personal chapter went to Paternoster Row. Mr. Jessup read it. Mr. Jessup wrote back, This is the finest chapter you have produced. I am publishing it as a standalone piece in the Literary Gazette. It appears Saturday. Miles could not stop it. The type was set. The chapter described a woman in a library, a woman whose hands were dusty and whose face was direct, and whose reading of the man was so precise that the man could feel her accuracy in his chest. Anyone who knew the Asheville Library would recognize it. Anyone who had met Harriet Lyle would recognize her. The Duke's secret was about to become the county's entertainment, and Miles had sent away the only person who already knew. We will take a very short break. If you do not want to miss new stories, please subscribe to the channel. The chapter published on Saturday in the Literary Gazette under the name Mrs. Catherine Fairholme. By Monday, Lady Fenimore had read it and dropped her tea. By Wednesday, the county knew that Mrs. Fairholme had been in the Asheville Library. By Thursday, the county knew that Mrs. Fairholme was the Duke of Asheville. 3 weeks passed between the library and the Michaelmas Assembly. 3 weeks in which Harriet did not hear from the Duke, and the Duke did not write, and Mr. Pruitt did not deliver messages, and the library at the Asheville estate remained uncatalogued from the letter N onward. 3 weeks in which Harriet continued to read, because reading was what Harriet did, and she reread The Lantern on the Stair, and she reread The Captain's Return, and she read them differently now because now she knew the hands that wrote them, and the hands mended shutters, and the hands had ink on the thumb, and the hands had caught her waist on a Tuesday afternoon when she fell from a ladder, and the reading was not the same. The Michaelmas Assembly was held on the 29th of September at the Hertfordshire Assembly Rooms. Everyone attended. It was the social settling of accounts for the entire county, the moment when the year's judgments were delivered over cold beef and warm wine, and the particular merciless efficiency of county gossip. This year, the county had something to settle. The Gazette chapter had seen to that. Miles attended because a duke does not hide. He stood by the wall of the assembly room with a glass of wine and the composed, arranged, empty expression of a man who had been producing 400 words of nothing in public rooms for 30 years, and who was now doing it while the county whispered and pointed and recalibrated around him. He had not seen Harriet in 3 weeks. The 3 weeks had been the longest passage of prose he had ever failed to write. Harriet attended because her father was invited, and because Harriet Lyle did not hide. She wore her green dress, the good one, the one she had worn in the library on the afternoon she found the page, and she walked into the assembly room with the straight-backed composure of a woman who had catalogued 3 private libraries and a duke's secret, and who was not going to be stared down by Hertfordshire. Lady Constance Waverley attended because Lady Constance had been waiting 5 weeks for an opportunity, and the opportunity had arrived in the pages of a literary magazine. Constance crossed the room. She said, loud enough for the surrounding circle to hear, "Miss Lyle, you must be very proud. 5 weeks in the Duke's library and now you are in the Gazette. The whole county is reading about the Duke's little cataloger. Tell me, did you know what you were cataloging, or was the discovery a surprise?" The implication settled over the room like frost. Harriet, alone in a library with an unmarried man for 5 weeks. Harriet, the subject of his most intimate writing. Harriet, the wallpaper woman. Harriet said, "Lady Constance." Constance said, "The county is curious, Miss Lyle. A woman in a man's house, his most private writing about her, published for all to read. You must understand how it appears." Harriet stood in the middle of the Hertfordshire Assembly Rooms. The county was watching. Miles was watching, from the wall, with the frozen composure of a man whose wall was doing damage to someone he loved and who could not make the wall stop because the wall was all he had. Harriet said, "I did not know the Duke of Asheville was Mrs. Fairholme. I discovered a manuscript page on a Tuesday afternoon on the top shelf of the east wall of his library, behind a collection of Latin grammars. I asked him about it. He said thank you for the tea and sent me home." The room was silent. She said, "The Duke is Mrs. Fairholme. He has written 9 novels under a woman's name because he has feelings that his mouth cannot produce and his pen can. Captain Julian Harding is a man who cannot speak. The Duke is a man who cannot speak. The novels are not fiction. They are the truest thing about him. I know this because I have read them for 4 years, and I have read him for 5 weeks, and the reading is the same. She said, "The scandal is not the writing. The writing is the best thing in England. The scandal is the hiding. The scandal is a man who writes the most honest sentences in the language at 3 in the morning and produces 400 words of nothing at dinner. The scandal is, 'Thank you for the tea.' The scandal is the wall." She said, "I am not ashamed to be in the Gazette. I am not ashamed of the library. I am a barrister's daughter. My hands are dusty. My dress is plain. And I have read the Duke more closely than anyone in this room. And what I have read is not a scandal. It is a man." The assembly room was silent. The county was processing. Lady Constance's face, which had been composed in the brittle architecture of attack, was cracking, because the attack had assumed shame, and the woman was not ashamed. Miles was at the wall. He had heard every word. She was standing alone in front of the county, defending him, and his mouth was producing nothing. Nothing. The same nothing it had produced at the Fenimore's dinner and in the library, and at every moment in 30 years when the mouth needed to produce something, and the wall would not let it. And the wall was destroying the woman who had spent 5 weeks proving that the wall was not necessary. And the wall was doing it in public. And Miles could feel the wall the way a man feels a structure that has been holding him up and is now holding him down. The same architecture, the same weight, and the weight was killing something. He stepped away from the wall. The room noticed. A duke moving in an assembly room is an event. A duke who has been standing like architecture all evening suddenly moving is a larger event. He crossed the room. He stood beside Harriet. She was looking at him with the brown, steady, reading eyes of a woman who had been reading him for 5 weeks, and who was reading him now, and who could see, with the clinical precision of a woman who read people for a living, that the face was doing something it had never done in public. The wallpaper was peeling. He said, "Miss Lyle is correct." The room held its breath. He said, "I am Mrs. Fairholme. I have written 9 novels under a name that is not mine because I have sentences inside me that my mouth cannot produce. Miss Lyle told me at a dinner party that my face was wallpaper. She was correct. Miss Lyle told me to read Mrs. Fairholme. I wrote Mrs. Fairholme. Miss Lyle catalogued my library for 5 weeks, and in 5 weeks she read me more accurately than anyone has read me in 30 years. When she asked me the truth, I said thank you for the tea and sent her away. She was the first person to see behind the wall, and I closed the wall on her. That is the scandal. Not the novels, not the library, the wall." The room was silent. Miles Courtenay was speaking in public. Miles Courtenay, who had produced 400 words of nothing over 3 courses at the Fenimore's dinner. Miles Courtenay, whose face had been wallpaper for 30 years. Miles Courtenay was standing in the Hertfordshire assembly rooms and producing words that were not nothing. He turned to Harriet. The room disappeared. The county disappeared. The wall, the 30 years of architecture, the composure that had been structural and was now rubble. All of it was gone, and what was left was a man standing in front of a woman. He said, "Harriet." He had never used her name. 5 weeks of Miss Lyle. The name entered the assembly room the way a held breath enters the air. The room heard it. The room knew what it meant. She said, very quietly, "That is the first interesting thing your mouth has produced." He said, "Harriet, I have been composing letters in every room I have entered for 3 years. None of them had an address." His voice stopped. The sentence was leaving his mouth for the first time, the sentence that had only ever existed in ink, in the study, by candlelight, and the leaving was physical, and the coming through was the most terrifying thing he had done in 6 years of writing about terrifying things. And he was doing it in front of the county, in front of 100 people, because the woman he loved had stood alone and spoken the truth, and the least he could do was stand beside her and speak it too. He said, "You are the address." The assembly room was silent, not the mannered silence of social calculation, the real silence, the silence that follows a wall coming down. 100 people in a room, and the room was as quiet as the study at 3 in the morning, when the candle was the only light and the pen was the only voice. Harriet looked at him. She was reading him. She had been reading him since the Fenimore dinner, and she was reading him now, and what she read was not wallpaper. What she read was the man who had written 9 novels and mended a shutter at Marsh Farm and caught her waist on a ladder and written ink on his thumb for 6 years, and who had just said, in front of the county, the sentence that had only ever existed on paper. She said, "You said it." He said, "I said it." She said, "Not Captain Harding, you." He said, "Me." Her face had weather, all weather. The 5 weeks in the library and the tea and the manuscripts and the shutter at Marsh Farm and the evening with the candles and the ledger and the 8 inches on the ladder and the 3 weeks of silence and the manuscript page folded in her ledger, and now this room, this man, this sentence spoken aloud for the first time, all of it visible on her face, unprotected, offered. She reached for his hand. She held it. The ink stain on his thumb was between their palms, the dark mark pressed against her skin. She said, "The ink." He said, "The ink does not come out. Pruitt has tried." She said, "Do not let it come out. The ink is the truest thing about you." A smile arrived at the Duke's face. Not the location where a smile applied for permission, not the neighborhood survey. A smile, complete, undefended. It transformed his face the way weather transforms a landscape. Everything that had been arrangement became life. The gray eyes creased, the mouth committed. For the first time in the memory of the Hertfordshire county, the Duke of Ashvale produced an expression that was not composed, and was not correct, and was not arranged. The county saw it. The county would remember it for 3 generations. She said, "There it is, the face, the real one." He kissed her. In the assembly room, in front of the county, in front of Lady Constance and Lady Fenimore, and Sir Henry Doggett, and every person who had ever said the Duke was very correct. He kissed her, and the kiss was not composed, and was not correct, and was not 400 words of nothing. The kiss was the first sentence Miles Courtenay had spoken with his mouth that was as honest as the sentences he wrote with his pen. The county gasped. Seneca was not present, but if he had been, he would have approved. Lady Fenimore declared the following week that she had always detected a literary quality in the Duke's bearing, which was generous nonsense, since the literary quality she had detected at her own dinner had been, "He is very correct." Sir Henry Doggett, at the sessions, announced he had always said the Duke had the look of a man who read too much, which was remarkable given that Sir Henry Doggett had never seen the Duke hold a book, and had once described reading as an indoor affliction. The county decided, within the fortnight, that it had always suspected. Counties are constructed on useful fictions, and this was among the more benign. Miles wrote a letter to the Gazette, claiming the novels under his own name. Harriet edited it. This was the most dangerous literary collaboration in England, because Harriet edited prose the way her father cross-examined witnesses, with thoroughness, no sentiment, and an expectation that every word would justify its existence. He wrote, "The pen is not retiring." She said, "That sounds like an announcement about a racehorse. Remove." He wrote, "The mouth has been taught to speak by a woman who told me my face was wallpaper." She said, "You are quoting me in a national publication." He said, "I am." She said, "Add, and who was correct?" Harriet went to see Lady Constance. This was not expected. Victors do not visit the defeated. Harriet was not experiencing the situation as a victory. She had seen Lady Constance's face at the assembly after the attack failed. The brittle architecture cracking, Behind it, not cruelty, terror. The specific terror of a woman whose life depended on a currency she could not earn, and a marriage she could not secure, and a future that was closing around her like cold water. Harriet sat in Lady Constance's drawing room. She said, "Mr. Jessup is seeking a reader for his publishing house. Someone who can assess manuscripts with intelligence. The position carries a salary and does not depend on a husband. I have recommended you." Lady Constance held her composure for 4 seconds. Then the composure broke. She wept. Not theatrically, briefly, totally. The weeping of a woman who had been offered safety by the person she had tried to destroy. Harriet did not comfort her. She sat across from her and let the weeping be. The letting be was the mercy. Letting a frightened woman weep without asking her to stop. Lady Constance said after, "Why?" Harriet said, "Because I have been afraid too. Different fear, same wall." The Dowager Duchess, when she heard the whole of it, said nothing for a long time. She sat in her chair by the fire, and she was quiet in a way that was not her customary quiet, which was the quiet of a woman preparing a remark, but a different quiet, which was the quiet of a woman who had been carrying something for 8 years and who was setting it down. She said, "I found the manuscript page 8 years ago. Your handwriting. I put it back. I have been reading your novels since the first one. I arranged the Fenimore's dinner. I suggested the seating. I suggested the library." Miles looked at his grandmother. 82. She had known for 8 years. She had read every novel. She had arranged the dinner and the seating and the library, the entire campaign, with the patience of a general who understood that walls come down from the inside. He said, "You knew." She said, "I knew. I have been your first reader for 8 years. I was waiting for your mouth to learn what your pen already understood." The Lyle woman accomplished in 5 weeks what I have been attempting for 8 years. She has the specific quality of being both very clever and very brave, which is a combination I have been looking for in a granddaughter for 3 decades. Miles's eyes filled. The filling did not spill. The filling remained, held in the gray slate eyes, the last act of the wall, and then the wall let go, and a single line traced a path down his face, and the Dowager reached across and placed her hand on his. She said, "The wallpaper is gone." He said, "Yes." She said, "Good. It was dreadful wallpaper." They married in October, in the library. Harriet's choice. The library held 9,000 volumes, and, on the shelf where Harriet had placed them at eye level for a man 6 feet tall, 9 novels by Mrs. Catherine Fairholme, which were, Harriet observed, the only honest books in the room. The ceremony was small. Harriet's father, the barrister, who had assessed the Duke with the same focused attention his daughter applied to novels, and who had concluded the Duke was acceptable, which from a barrister was applause. Mr. Pruitt, holding the ring with the care of a man who had held manuscripts for 6 years, and who understood that some objects are not objects, but sentences. Seneca beneath the reading desk, positioned there by Mr. Pruitt to prevent the animal from contributing to the proceedings in ways that would be sincere, unhelpful, and difficult to explain to a magistrate. The Dowager sat in the front chair. She did not weep. Augusta Courtenay had not wept since the autumn of 1793, and had no plans to begin. She did, however, adjust the lace at her cuffs with unusual frequency, which was the Dowager's physiological equivalent of weeping, and which Mr. Pruitt recognized and would later describe to Mrs. Lennox as the most emotional cuff adjustment he had witnessed in 12 years of domestic service. Every night, Miles wrote, in his study at his desk, with the candle and the pen and Seneca under the desk. He wrote under his own name now, Miles Courtenay, not Mrs. Fairholme, not Captain Harding. The pen and the mouth were, for the first time in 30 years, the same instrument. Every morning Harriet read what he had written. At the breakfast table, beside her tea, with the focused attention of a woman who still had opinions about his adjective choices, and who delivered them with the warmth and precision of a controlled demolition. She said, one morning, reading a page, "This is good." He said, "Good or effective?" She said, "Good. Real good. Not wallpaper good." He said, "Weather good?" She said, "Considerable weather." She picked up her tea. She read. He ate his toast. Seneca was under the table. Mr. Pruitt was at the sideboard. The morning was ordinary. The ordinary was the extraordinary part. The extraordinary was a man and a woman at a breakfast table, one writing and one reading. The writing and the reading the same conversation, conducted across toast and ink and tea, in weather, without a wall. The wall was gone. The weather was here. The room was the only room. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you are watching from and what the story made you feel. Do not forget to subscribe so you will not miss new stories.